Yeah, we've got a lot to talk about. Hey everybody, you're watching a physio named Jonah, and that's this guy, where today's video is a bit of an unexpected one. I was planning on releasing a partner to my most recent video, but the world of Canadian physiotherapy had other plans. Over the weekend, a virtual exam was supposed to take place that would certify physio residents to become fully licensed physiotherapists. However, because of tech issues, the exam was cancelled barely before it even got underway. What's followed has been a pretty big outpouring of emotion and justifiably frustration, so it would seem kind of disingenuous for me to talk about just about anything else as a Canadian physio. For this video, I'm going to start by trying to put this whole situation into context for those who may not be aware of the situation, go through a step-by-step of the events that led us here to this past weekend, and then open up a discussion for where do we go from here. In the comment section, I look forward to hearing from you guys on that last point of where do we go from here. I look forward to discussing with anyone who's interested this kind of insane situation we found ourselves in. But before I get too rambly and all over the place, because there's a lot going on in this video, let's start putting things in context. If you're not a Canadian trained physio or someone who's attempted this exam before, this whole situation might not make a whole lot of sense, so I'm going to try and let you into the loop right here. Becoming a physiotherapist in Canada is a multi-step journey. It starts by obtaining your bachelor's degree or your undergraduate degree from a university. After that, you have to make it through the admissions and selection process into a master's program of physiotherapy for an additional 2 years. There are 15 schools in Canada, with 10 of them offering programs in English and 5 of them in French. Now, after you complete your 2-year master's education, you are now considered a physiotherapy resident until you pass the practical competency examination. This is split up into 2 components. There's a written component, which is 200 multiple choice questions, and then there is a practical component. 16 stations, about 10 minutes each, all involving an actor pretending to be a patient and an examiner watching your actions in the room with you. If you're successful in passing both of these examinations, you will no longer be a physio resident, you'll be able to be a fully licensed physiotherapist. My program at U of T and a lot of other ones across the country include practical examinations within the program to prepare you for this national practical examination. This exam format can be quite useful because, unlike a paper written exam, it forces you to think on your feet and react to a moment, and it shows how you interact with a person across from you, even if it is a fairly staged experience. The national practical exam, however, that happens after your schooling is a uniquely challenging and stressful experience, largely because of the consequences of failing it, but we're going to get there soon. Hopefully that makes sense as an outline for how this process works, but to ground it in some emotions and reality, I'm going to use myself as an example. I mean, why not switch it up for once and talk about me on my own YouTube channel? Alright, I did my 4-year bachelor's or undergraduate degree at the University of Ottawa. In the fall of my 4th year, I applied to physiotherapy school. After a long and honestly very, very painful wait through the admissions process, I was accepted to the University of Toronto's Masters of Physiotherapy for that fall. So now I'm into my 2-year Masters of Physiotherapy program. It isn't long before you start hearing about this national practical exam. I honestly think it would have been within the first 6 months of the program that we started to hear talk of this really big, intimidating exam that happens at the end of it. And it just sort of builds as you go through the program. Every time you pass through another unit and go through new skills, you start to think about these are new things that I'm going to be tested on that national exam after this program. I bring this point up just to sort of put into context the anxiety that is there around this exam. You're already well aware of it during your schooling, and as it becomes closer and closer and closer, it just grows bigger and bigger in your mind because of how important it is. I graduated from my Master's of Physiotherapy program in August of 2019 and started working as a resident in September of 2019. Working as a resident within Canada means that you have to have a supervisor who is responsible for you, and you also usually receive lower income. So why is this exam such a big deal? Well, I wrote my practical national exam in November of 2019. You hear back about your results a few months later. If, when I got those results back, I failed that exam, I would lose my ability to practice physiotherapy as a resident and not be able to get back my ability to practice physiotherapy until I passed this exam. The next exam was not until June of that year, where the results come out around August. This means that if I had failed my national exam in November, I would have had to stop practicing as a physiotherapy resident in February and not practice physiotherapy again at all until August of that same year at the earliest, if I passed my June exam. One more time for the folks in the back. If you fail your practical exam, you lose your provisional practice license, and you do not get that back until you get your full license when you pass the next exam you take. Again, I bring all of this up to put this exam in context for those who don't know. This exam means a lot in the professional life of physiotherapists, and that wait from November when I wrote my exam until the end of January was honestly potentially the longest 2 months of my life, because you know how much is hanging in the balance. The more astute of you out there may have noticed that my rewrite date, or that next opportunity to do the practical in-person exam, was June of 2020. Recall COVID really hit its, I don't need to tell you guys about that, you all know when COVID started. Imagine in June of 2020 an exam where you have to bring lots of people together for an in-person practical exam with lots of touching patients and examiners. I think we all know how it goes. Last piece of context before we get into the recent events is the layout of the physiotherapy system in Canada. There are three main players that I want to point out here. First up is the College of Physiotherapists. Every province has their own that governs that province. Their job is to protect the public. Essentially, they make the rules and guidelines that govern how we act as physiotherapists and who gets to get/keep their licenses. Next up are the Physiotherapy Associations. The Canadian Physiotherapy Association is split into different groups for each province, all within the same matter of the CPA. Now, their job, as opposed to the college who creates the rules, is a representation of our profession. They represent us and advocate on behalf of physiotherapists and our interests as practitioners. Here comes the big one from the recent events, CAPR, or the CAPR, which kind of sounds like a Star Wars vehicle if you just put a couple numbers after it, but that's besides the point. The Canadian Alliance of Physiotherapy Regulators has one main purpose. That is to create and provide the examinations that license physiotherapists to practice in Canada. They create the written and practical exams that we'll be talking about. College creates the rules for physios, associations represent physios, and CAPR creates and delivers the exams that decide who gets to become a physio. Let's get into the events. So as you're all painfully aware by this point, 2020 was the year that COVID sidetracked essentially all in-person activities known to humanity. The in-person national practical exam scheduled for June 2020 was one of those activities. The written exam hasn't been posing as much of an issue because it's a lot easier to switch into a virtual format. The written exam was already done on a computer in a multiple choice format. It was just done before in a computer lab so that you could sit side by side with other nervous and super sweaty physios and share in the suffering. I mean, the written component of the national exam lends itself pretty well to COVID and the distancing that comes with it. Once they figured out a secure server and how to run things online, it really wasn't that big of an issue. The in-person practical is a bit of a different story. Spring of 2020 rolls around and lots of students have been preparing and stressing for the exam coming up in June. They've taken time off of work to study, which is, usually unpaid, and that's on top of putting up the money that you have to in order to secure your spot in line. Surprise, surprise, in May of 2020, the exam that was scheduled for June of 2020 gets moved to November of 2020, with that exam that would have been happening in November 2020 getting pushed to the first quarter of 2021. Buckle up, this is only going to get more confusing as we go along. I think that at this point, although everyone was obviously quite frustrated and this was very inconvenient, there's a little more understanding. We're in the first wave of COVID in Canada. There was a lot more uncertainty about what was going on, and I think that delaying it to November, while inconvenient, was seen as an okay solution that wouldn't delay everything too much. Still very inconvenient, not a great solution, but I think it was acceptable at the time. Around this time, the CAPR created a letter framework to organize who was scheduled to take what exam when, what they had already done, and which exam they would be writing come the fall. I have been looking at this thing for about 15 minutes. I really don't understand it. If anybody does, please let me know in the comment section because I'm really not sure what I'm looking at. I went back through CAPR's website to track the genesis of this whole situation. I know there was likely more conversation between people who were going to be writing the exam and CAPR directly through email, so share any additional information if you have it, but I'll be going over the official releases from CAPR and how things progressed through that. June 2020 shows up and CAPR releases a statement on the website that we are on track in order to do the exams coming up that November. I think there was a fair bit of optimism in the air. COVID was starting to calm itself down in Canada and things were looking up for the fall. Hey! August 2020, CAPR releases more of the same with a little bit less certainty involved. There was a bit of an air of, we get it, you guys have questions, but don't worry, everything's gonna be okay. We don't have answers, but everything's gonna be okay. It wasn't. September 16th, 2020, CAPR declares that at the in-person exam in November, they won't be able to accommodate all of the students who were scheduled and rerouted from that June of 2020 exam. This is obviously frustrating and very inconvenient, but it's only going to get worse. September 25th, 2020. After a meeting between CAPR officials on September 23rd, 2020, all in-person exams for the remainder of the year are cancelled. So all of those who were supposed to write in June of 2020 but had that cancelled now have been cancelled for November of 2020. Things are getting bad. Now, the levels of frustration are definitely getting higher. We've now had this exam postponed or cancelled twice. But in October of 2020, here comes a glimmer of potential hope at the time. CAPR announces changes to their examination process that will drop the total number of questions from 16 down to 12, take away the criterion that you have to pass a certain number of stations, but here's the big one. The entire practical examination will be delivered virtually. This was a very big deal because, as we now know, an in-person exam would have been doomed to fail for, honestly, the foreseeable future. Moving it to an online format, I think, made sense to try and avoid more cancellations. In addition, CAPR was hoping that it would allow them to run more exams and start to work their way through the backlog of candidates that had been building up since the last June and now this most recent November cancellation. From November 2020 until March 2021, where we are now, CAPR was in full-on practical exam prep mode. CAPR was releasing blueprints, modules, they had resources on what to study, resources for how the exam was made. Things looked like prep was in full swing and that this was going to be the way to make this happen. The first virtual physiotherapy practical competency exam is set for March 20th and 21st. Physio hopefuls from across the country are going to be showing up virtually to hopefully put this section of their professional lives behind them. 6 stations on Saturday, 6 stations on Sunday. Let's make it happen. What happened? Examinees woke up, logged on, ready to start day 1 of 2, and uh-oh. Yes, the system encountered the fatal flaw of significant technical difficulties. I mean, this is 2021. I don't think any of us are strangers to technical difficulties, especially given the past year that everyone's had. But I don't think that makes this whole thing any less unacceptable. Previous cancellations or postponements had had at least some semblance of warning or reasonable kind of arguing behind why that had to happen. This one, yeah, this is bad. After the cancellation on Saturday, the Canadian Physiotherapy Association called on CAPR to refund those who had been enrolled in the exam their fees for writing. They have done that. The CPA also recommended that the colleges in each province remove the need for completion of this practical exam in order to have a license to practice. That, as of yet, has not happened, but I have seen a statement from the College of Physiotherapists of Ontario, where I work, where they're going to be considering different options moving forward. One of the most interesting things in the CPA statement to me was the reevaluation of the examination process that licenses physiotherapists to work in Canada. Which brings us to the question, I think that this is a really valid question, and this is the discussion that I think we should be having right now. What is the best course of action moving forward? Refunding the exam fees to the candidates was a no-brainer and definitely the right move for CAPR to make. But should they be required to now pass the next exam in order for licensing? This is one of the questions that remains to be seen. To stimulate discussion, other allied health professions in Canada, such as occupational therapy, speech-language pathology, or nursing, do not have practical examinations after their courses. After you complete your master's or education in any of those, there is a written component, and then you are able to practice with your license in Canada. So a question I've heard is, why is education and a written competency exam enough for practice within those professions, but we have a practical component in addition to those in physiotherapy? Furthering the same point, other countries that have physiotherapy as a recognized profession don't all have practical examinations to go along with it. There are others that include just a written component exam when you finish your education and then opt for in-the-workplace assessments like audits. Now, I don't have an insane amount to offer here as far as wisdom or answers moving forward goes, but I will give my 2 cents for what it's worth. I don't know that the practical in-person national exam necessarily tests your ability to be a good physiotherapist as it does to stay calm and answer questions correctly under an insane pressure situation. The looming threat over your head of losing your job for 8 months makes an already stressful exam environment and experience into a bit of a walking nightmare. And I honestly think that a lot of people who fail that exam do so because of the stressful situation that's been created, as opposed to their knowledge or their ability to practice as a physiotherapist. And again, I haven't been practicing forever, I don't sit in any committees, this is just my experience, but I can honestly say that after having done the practical exam last November, I have not had a single day in clinic that felt like that exam. But what does this all mean for internationally trained physiotherapists who are coming to Canada? Should we opt for just more in-practice assessments as opposed to in-person national exams moving forwards? Should we even attempt another virtual exam under this COVID conditions, given what already happened with this one? Let me know in the comment section below what you guys are thinking, and let's open up that discussion. So my final thoughts here are for any of those who were affected by the most recent cancellation or any of the prior ones. I really am honestly sorry that you guys had to go through this whole situation. I remember what it was like to be a student preparing for that exam and the amount of stress that was built up towards it, the stakes, the way it changes your life before you have written the exam. And I can only imagine how emotionally charged of a moment it must have been to have that canceled at the last second as you're preparing to write it. Amidst all of the frustration and anger and rightful disappointment, I'm hopeful that we can somehow move forward as a profession better. Moments like this could provide an opportunity to better the processes that we have in place and engage in a moment of self-reflection on our practice. I'll be really interested to see what the colleges do moving forward and how this affects the current candidates and future candidates for these exams. Kind of a dark or somber place to end this video, especially in comparison to my usual YouTube videos, but honestly it wasn't that great of a weekend for the profession of physiotherapy or for a lot of physiotherapist hopefuls. It's a weekend that makes my normal sign-off for YouTube sound a little bit corny, but sometimes you can find something within corny, and hopefully we can all find something moving forward out of this, which is also corny in and of itself. But anyway guys, move your body, have a laugh today, and I will see you at the next video.